The amp was still humming when the house lights flickered once, twice, and then the Saville Theatre went dark. June 1st, 1967. London. A Sunday evening that started with polite applause and ended with something nobody in that room would ever fully explain. But the part of this story that matters most did not happen on stage. It happened in a balcony seat, in the chest of a man who had written some of the most famous songs on the planet, who sat watching a 24-year-old guitarist rip open the fabric of his own creation and show him colors he never knew he had painted. That man was John Lennon, and what he witnessed in the next 3 minutes would quietly haunt him for the rest of his life. But before we get to that moment, we need to understand why it mattered, not just for Lennon, not just for the guitarist on stage, but for the entire trajectory of popular music in the second half of the 20th century. Rewind 48 hours. On the 1st of June, 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was not just an album, it was an event, a cultural earthquake that shook the foundations of what a rock record could be. Months of painstaking studio work at Abbey Road, orchestral arrangements, tape loops, backwards recordings, sound effects layered with obsessive precision. George Martin and the four Beatles had constructed something that felt less like a collection of songs and more like an architectural monument built from sound. The British press was already calling it a masterpiece before most people had even heard it. Record shops across London had queues stretching around the block. Radio stations played it front to back without commercial interruption. In the space of a single weekend, Sgt. Pepper's had become the measuring stick against which every piece of popular music would be judged for years to come. John Lennon, in particular, felt the weight of what they had accomplished. He had poured himself into this record. The production, the concepts, the lyrical ambition that pushed far beyond the love-me-do simplicity of their earlier work. This was the Beatles proving they were not just a pop group. This was art, and Lennon, more than any of the other three, needed the world to recognize it as such. So, when he took his seat at the Saville Theatre on that Sunday evening, he was riding the highest creative wave of his life. But Paul McCartney was beside him. The theater belonged to Brian Epstein, their manager, who had been hosting live concerts there as a side venture. The evening's headliner was the Jimi Hendrix Experience, a three-piece band that had been tearing through London's club scene with a ferocity that made established guitarists nervous. Lennon knew who Jimi Hendrix was, of course. Everyone in London's music world knew by then. The American guitarist had arrived in England less than a year earlier, virtually unknown, brought over by Chas Chandler, the former bassist of the Animals, who had seen something in this quiet, left-handed player from Seattle that convinced him to bet his entire management career on a single musician. Within weeks of arriving, Jimmy had begun dismantling the hierarchy of London's guitar scene. Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Pete Townshend, all of them had watched Jimmy play and walked away shaken, recalibrating their understanding of what the electric guitar could do. But Lennon was not a guitarist in the competitive sense. He was a songwriter, a conceptualist, a man who thought in terms of records and statements and cultural moments rather than fretboard pyrotechnics. He respected Jimmy's playing the way one might respect a force of nature, with admiration and a comfortable distance. The two occupied different worlds within the same musical universe, or so Lennon believed. The Saville Theatre was intimate by major venue standards, capacity around 1,500, the kind of room where you could see the sweat on a performer's face from the 10th row and feel the bass vibrations in your sternum. The audience that night was a cross-section of London's creative elite: musicians, producers, journalists, filmmakers, fashion designers, the entire ecosystem of people who determined what was culturally relevant in 1967 Britain. The lights dropped, the crowd settled, and then it began. But what happened next was not what anyone expected. Not the audience, not McCartney, and certainly not John Lennon. Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage carrying his white Fender Stratocaster, the instrument that was becoming as recognizable as its owner. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell took their positions on bass and drums. The three of them had been performing together for only a few months, but they had already developed the kind of telepathic musical communication that usually takes years to build. Jimi plugged in. The amplifier crackled to life with that familiar electric hum, the sound of potential energy waiting to be released. He stepped to the microphone, and instead of launching into one of his own songs, instead of opening with the explosive riff of Purple Haze or the driving groove of Foxy Lady, Jimi Hendrix looked out at the audience and began playing the title track of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album that had been released approximately 72 hours earlier. The audacity of this choice is difficult to overstate. The Beatles' new album was the most anticipated release in popular music history. It had been available for barely 3 days. The production was so complex, so layered, so dependent on studio techniques that many assumed the songs could never be reproduced live. And here was this 24-year-old American, standing on a London stage in front of two of the men who had created it, reimagining their masterpiece in real time through his Stratocaster. But the audacity was only the beginning. What mattered was the execution. Jimi did not play a faithful cover. He did not attempt to replicate the album's ornate production with a 3-piece band. Instead, he did something far more dangerous and far more revealing. He deconstructed the song. He stripped away the studio wizardry, the layered vocals, the orchestral flourishes, and exposed the raw musical architecture underneath. Then he rebuilt it in his own image. His fingers found the melody, but they found it differently than the Beatles had written it. He bent notes that the original kept straight. He added harmonic textures that the studio version never explored. He made the Stratocaster sing the vocal melody with a tone so human, so expressive, that the guitar seemed to be breathing the words rather than playing the notes. The rhythm section locked in behind him. Mitchell's drums pushed and pulled against the beat with a jazz musician's instinct for controlled chaos. Redding's bass held the foundation while Jimi built cathedrals of sound above it. The three of them transformed a meticulously produced studio recording into a living, breathing, improvised conversation between musicians who understood each other at a molecular level. In the balcony, John Lennon leaned forward in his seat. There is a particular kind of shock that comes from hearing your own creation presented back to you in a form you never imagined. It is not quite surprise. It is not quite admiration. It is something closer to vertigo. The sudden realization that something you thought you understood completely contains dimensions you never perceived. Lennon was hearing his own song, but he was hearing it as if for the first time, as if someone had taken a painting he had labored over for months and shown him that it contained hidden images visible only from angles he had never considered. Biographies and accounts from people who were present describe a visible change in Lennon's demeanor during those minutes. The confident, almost proprietary satisfaction of a man hearing his masterpiece celebrated in public gave way to something more complex. His expression shifted. His body language changed. According to those who were sitting near him, Lennon stopped being a spectator and became a student, absorbing what was happening on stage with the intense concentration of someone encountering an idea that challenged everything they thought they knew. McCartney, sitting beside him, was reportedly smiling broadly, enjoying the tribute, appreciating the showmanship. But Lennon's reaction was different, deeper, more troubled, because Lennon understood something that went beyond flattery. Jimi was not just covering their song, he was improving it. Or rather, he was revealing possibilities within it that the Beatles themselves had not found, despite months of meticulous studio work. This was the hidden wound. The quiet devastation that no one in the audience could see but that Lennon carried with him long after the amplifiers cooled. You consider what this meant for a man like John Lennon. He had just released what he considered his greatest artistic achievement, the culmination of years of creative growth, of pushing the Beatles beyond pop conventions, of fighting for the right to make records that mattered as art and not just entertainment. Sgt. Pepper's was his proof, his evidence, his argument made in vinyl and cardboard, and within 72 hours, a young man with a Stratocaster had casually demonstrated that the song could go further, that the musical ideas the Beatles had labored over could be extended, deepened, taken to places the creators themselves had not imagined. Not through months of studio experimentation, but through raw interpretive genius and 6 strings. Now, here is the detail that most accounts mention only briefly, but that reveals the true significance of this moment. Jimi had learned the song in less than 3 days. Some accounts suggest he worked it out backstage just hours before the performance. Others indicate he had been listening to the album obsessively since getting an advance copy, absorbing its structures and harmonies with the supernatural speed that characterized his musical mind. Either way, the gap between the Beatles' months of studio labor and Jimi's rapid reinterpretation was staggering. This was not a prepared arrangement polished through weeks of rehearsal. This was Jimi Hendrix hearing a piece of music, understanding its deepest structural principles almost instantly, and then expressing that understanding through his instrument with a fluency that made the complex appear effortless. But the performance did not stop with the title track. After establishing his reinterpretation, Jimi transitioned into the rest of the set, weaving elements of the Sgt. Pepper's arrangement into his own material, creating musical connections between the Beatles' studio innovations and his own sonic explorations. The performance became a dialogue between 2 musical visions, a conversation that Jimi was conducting in real time while one of its participants sat in the balcony, unable to respond. The audience's reaction was electric. People who were there have described a collective recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a great performance, no, but a statement about the nature of musical genius itself, about the difference between creating something extraordinary and understanding something extraordinary, about the gap between composition and interpretation, and the rare moments when interpretation transcends the original. When the set ended, the applause was enormous, but in the balcony, something quieter and more significant was happening. Lennon sat for a moment without moving. McCartney was clapping, turning to John with an expression of delighted surprise. But Lennon's face, according to those who observed him, carried a different emotion entirely. Not jealousy, not resentment, something more nuanced and more painful. The recognition that creative genius has no ceiling, and that no matter how high you climb, someone might reach higher, not by competing with you but by standing on the very structures you built. What happened next has been recounted in various forms across decades of music journalism, though the details vary depending on the source. Backstage encounters between musicians in 1967 London were fluid, informal affairs. The rigid separation between performers and audience that characterizes modern concerts did not exist in the same way. People moved freely between the stage and the seats, the dressing rooms and the bars, the professional spaces and the social ones. Accounts from the period describe Lennon seeking out Jimi after the performance. Not immediately. There was a gap, a period of processing, of letting the emotional impact settle before translating it into social interaction. But eventually, in the crowded backstage area of the Saville Theatre, the 2 men came face to face. The contrast between them was striking. Lennon, 26, dressed in the psychedelic finery that had become the Beatles' visual signature, carrying the quiet authority of the most famous musician on the planet. Jimi, 24, still radiating the physical energy of performance, his Stratocaster hanging from its strap like a weapon recently discharged, sweat cooling on his forehead, his eyes carrying that particular post-performance intensity that people who knew him described as simultaneously present and elsewhere. Lennon's first words, according to accounts that have circulated through music history, were not about the Sgt. Pepper's rendition specifically. He reportedly approached the conversation sideways. He'd talking about the show generally before circling toward the moment that had actually affected him. This was characteristic of Lennon, a man who could be brutally direct about almost anything except his own vulnerability. When something truly moved him, he approached it cautiously, testing the emotional terrain before committing to honesty. But when the conversation finally arrived at the Sgt. Pepper's performance, Lennon's guard dropped. He told Jimi, in words that have been paraphrased differently by different sources but whose essential meaning remains consistent, that hearing his song played that way had changed something in how he understood his own music, that Jimi had found rooms inside the song that Lennon did not know existed, that the experience was both flattering and unsettling in equal measure. Jimi's response, it by all accounts, was characteristically humble. He deflected the compliment toward the song itself, suggesting that the music had always contained those possibilities and that he had simply followed where the notes led. This was not false modesty. People who knew Jimi well have consistently described a genuine disconnect between his extraordinary abilities and his self-perception. He did not experience his playing as exceptional. He experienced it as natural, as inevitable, as simply what the music required. This humility was perhaps the most disarming aspect of the encounter. Lennon had arrived backstage carrying the emotional weight of having been artistically challenged. He was prepared for ego, for competition, for the kind of territorial posturing that characterized interactions between major musicians of the era. Instead, he found someone who seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion that what he had done was remarkable. The two men talked for a considerable time. The conversation, according to fragmentary accounts that have survived, ranged across topics that musicians in their position rarely discussed openly: the loneliness of creative ambition, the pressure of expectations that grew faster than any artist's ability to meet them, the strange isolation of being simultaneously the most visible people in a room and the least understood. Lennon later described this conversation to close associates as one of the most significant musical discussions of his life, not because of any specific insight or piece of advice, but because it revealed a way of thinking about music that was fundamentally different from his own. Where Lennon constructed songs from ideas, concepts, lyrical images, and cultural references, Jimi seemed to grow them organically from pure sound, letting the frequencies themselves determine the structure. The impact of that evening extended far beyond the immediate emotional response. In the months and years that followed, traces of the encounter appeared in Lennon's work. His increasing interest in sonic experimentation, his willingness to let sound take priority over conventional song structure, his growing fascination with feedback and distortion as compositional tools rather than mere effects. These developments had multiple causes, of course, but biographers and music historians have noted that the Saville Theatre experience represented a turning point in Lennon's artistic evolution, the moment when the songwriter began thinking like a sound architect. For Jimi, the encounter confirmed something different. It validated his belief that music was a universal language that transcended the boundaries of genre and methodology, that a song written in a studio by four men using techniques borrowed from classical music and musique concrète could be reinterpreted through a single electric guitar and not just survive the translation, but expand through it. That the essence of great music was not its production or its arrangement, but something deeper, something structural, something that lived in the relationships between notes rather than in the notes themselves. But perhaps the deepest significance of that evening lay in what it revealed about the nature of artistic respect. Lennon could have felt threatened. He could have dismissed the performance as showing off, as empty virtuosity, as a younger musician trying to prove himself at the expense of an established master. Some artists would have responded that way. The history of popular music is filled with examples of ego-driven rivalries that produced more heat than light. Instead, Lennon chose to learn. He chose to let the experience change him rather than defend himself against it. He absorbed the lesson that Jimi's performance contained, not as a defeat, but as an expansion, a widening of his own creative possibilities that could only have come from encountering a form of genius different from his own. This choice, this willingness to be transformed by another artist's vision, may have been Lennon's most significant creative act that evening. It's because it demonstrated a quality that separates the truly great from the merely accomplished. The capacity to recognize that your own understanding of your art is not the final word. That somewhere out there someone might hear more in your music than you put in it, and that this is not a threat but a gift. Years later, in the early 1970s, Lennon would occasionally reference that evening in conversations with other musicians. He never spoke about it publicly in any extensive way. It remained one of those private musical experiences that shaped an artist's development without becoming part of the official narrative. But the people he told understood its significance. They heard it in the way his voice changed when he described watching Jimi play, and in the slight pause before he spoke about what it felt like to hear your own song come back to you, transformed. Jimi Hendrix passed away in September of 1970. He was 27 years old. The loss was devastating to the music world and to those who knew him personally. Lennon, by then deep in his own personal and creative turmoil as the Beatles dissolved, felt the loss acutely. According to those close to him, Lennon spoke about Jimi's death not in terms of what the world had lost, though that was immeasurable, but in terms of what had been left unfinished. The conversations not yet had. The collaborations not yet attempted. The mutual artistic evolution that had only just begun. There is a particular cruelty in the death of an artist who is still ascending. Jimi, at 27, was not a finished product. He was an artist in the middle of becoming something that even he could not fully articulate. The studio experiments, the increasing complexity of his compositions, the growing sophistication of his harmonic language, all of these pointed toward a future that was never realized. And Lennon, who understood ambition and evolution better than almost anyone in popular music, felt the weight of that unrealized potential. Because what happened on that June evening in 1967 was not really about one musician covering another musician's song. It was about the nature of creative ownership itself, about the moment when a piece of art leaves its creator's hands and becomes something larger, something that belongs to everyone who encounters it, like something that can be reimagined and extended and transformed in ways the original artist never conceived. Lennon spent 4 months building Sgt. Pepper's. Jimi learned the title track in a matter of hours and played it live 3 days after its release. And in doing so, he demonstrated that great art is not diminished by reinterpretation. It is amplified. Jimi Hendrix picked up his Stratocaster on a Sunday night in London and played a song that was 3 days old as if it had always belonged to him. John Lennon sat in the balcony and heard his own creation speak in a voice he did not recognize. And in that gap, in that space between what the songwriter intended and what the guitarist discovered, something essential about the nature of music revealed itself. Some songs are containers, and they hold exactly what you put in them and nothing more. But the great ones are doors. They open onto rooms the builder never entered, and sometimes it takes a stranger with a different key to show you how large the house really is. That night at the Saville Theatre, John Lennon learned that Sgt. Pepper's was a door, and Jimi Hendrix was the one who opened it. Decades later, the echo of that performance still resonates. Not because of what it proved about Jimi's talent, which needed no further proof, but because of what it revealed about the relationship between creation and interpretation. Between the artist who builds the structure and the artist who shows everyone, including the builder, what the structure can hold. Lennon felt all of it in those few minutes at the Saville Theatre, and he was wise enough to let it change him. But there is one more detail that most retellings leave out. One small moment that happened before Jimi even touched the guitar that evening, before the house lights dropped, before the amplifiers warmed up, before any of it. Jimi was backstage, alone in a corridor, holding the white Stratocaster. Someone passing by asked him what he was going to open with. Jimi looked at the guitar and said very quietly, something that the person later recalled to a journalist years after both Lennon and Hendrix were gone. He said he wanted to play something that would make the Beatles proud, not something that would impress them, not something that would outshine them, something that would make them proud. And that single word, proud, contains everything you need to know about who Jimi Hendrix was as a musician and as a human being. He was not competing with the Beatles that night. He was honoring them. He was taking the most celebrated piece of music in the world and treating it with the same reverence and curiosity that he brought to every note he ever played. The same deep listening, the same willingness to follow the music wherever it wanted to go, the same belief that every song, no matter who wrote it, contained more than its creator knew. John Lennon heard all of this from his balcony seat, even if he could not have articulated it in the moment. He heard the respect. He heard the love. He heard the quiet declaration that great music belongs to everyone brave enough to play it honestly. And that is why, when the two men finally spoke backstage, there was no confrontation, no territorial defensiveness, no ego, yet just two musicians standing in the shared light of a song that had, for a few electric minutes, belonged to both of them equally. Some encounters change the people in them. Some performances outlive the rooms where they happen. And sometimes the greatest tribute one artist can pay another is not imitation, but transformation. Taking something beautiful and showing the world and its creator that it was even more beautiful than anyone knew. That is what happened at the Saville Theatre on June 1st, 1967. That is the night John Lennon heard his own masterpiece played back to him by a 24-year-old genius with a white Stratocaster and a quiet desire to make the Beatles proud. And nothing, for either of them, was quite the same after that.